Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S MindLab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Have you ever felt like there is no single right way to understand something complex like consciousness itself? Well, this new paper dives deep into that exact idea. So imagine you are trying to figure out how consciousness works. Many scientists are working on this, but they often come up with very different answers. It's like a scientific puzzle where different pieces don't seem to fit together. Some researchers focus on one part, others on another, and they end up with theories that seem to contradict each other. This has led to a bit of a stalemate in consciousness science. One way to think about this is that maybe we're all looking at different parts of the same elephant, like in that old story, consciousness might have many different aspects, like self-awareness or feeling pain, and each theory might be capturing just one of those. But the authors of this paper point out a problem with this idea. Most researchers agree they're trying to explain the same thing, phenomenal consciousness, or what it feels like to have an experience. So it's not just about different aspects. There is also evidence suggesting that the very mechanisms that make things conscious might be different in different parts of the brain, or even for different types of experiences. Think about how different your visual experience is from your auditory experience, or even how thinking about a color might involve different brain processes than thinking about a shape. And then there is the fascinating question of animal consciousness. Could an octopus, with its very different brain structure, be conscious in a fundamentally different way than we are? These kinds of questions lead to a more radical idea. Maybe there isn't just one way for consciousness to happen. This brings us to the core idea of this paper, which explores a concept called pluralism in consciousness science. Basically, it's the idea that there might be multiple distinct ways or principles that can create conscious experience. Instead of one single mechanism for consciousness, there could be several different ones. This is a big departure from the traditional view, which often looks for a single, unified explanation. The authors set out to explore this idea of pluralism. They want to figure out under what conditions this idea of multiple ways to be conscious could actually be a useful scientific concept, rather than just a way to explain away disagreements. They propose that for pluralism to work, we need to distinguish between the brain mechanisms that make any content conscious, the general consciousness factor, and the mechanisms that create the specific content of that consciousness, like seeing red or hearing a sound. They also argue that the number of these different consciousness mechanisms needs to be limited and organized in a systematic way for science to make progress. To understand their argument better, we need to grasp a key distinction they make: the difference between one-factor and two-factor theories of consciousness. Think of it like this. Your conscious experience has content what you're seeing, hearing, feeling. It also has the quality of being subjectively experienced, while being conscious. A one-factor theory says that the same mechanism that creates the content also makes it conscious. So how your brain processes the color red is precisely what makes that experience of red conscious. Integrated Information Theory, or IIT, is an example they mention. It suggests that the way information is integrated in the brain is what constitutes consciousness and its contents. A two-factor theory, on the other hand, proposes that there are separate systems. One system figures out the content, like processing the visual information of a red apple, and a different system then takes that content and makes it conscious. This second system is what they call the general consciousness, conferring factor. Think of recurrent neural processing where the brain might process information again and again. And this reprocessing is what allows it to become conscious, regardless of whether it is visual, auditory, or something else. The authors emphasize that for this to work, the consciousness factor needs to cause the content to become conscious. Now, let's dive into the different types of pluralism they discuss. They introduce two main versions: weak pluralism and strong pluralism. Weak pluralism suggests there is only one kind of mechanism that makes things conscious, but this mechanism can be realized in different physical parts of the brain. For example, the principle of recurrent processing might be the way to make things conscious, but this recurrent processing could happen in visual areas for visual experiences or auditory areas for auditory experiences. The authors find this version less revolutionary because they believe different brain areas naturally do different things. They suggest that theories like the global neuronal workspace theory, GNWT, which talks about information being broadcast across the brain, could fit under weak pluralism if the specific neural networks involved in this workspace can change. Strong pluralism is where things get more interesting. This view proposes that there isn't just one principle of consciousness, but multiple fundamentally different principles that can create conscious experience, and these could even operate within the same brain at different times. For example, one type of experience might be made conscious by recurrent processing, while another type might be made conscious by higher, order thought processes. They use an analogy: just as heat can be generated by metabolism, friction, or combustion, consciousness might arise from different generators. The authors argue strongly for a two-factor strong pluralism. This means that for each distinct type of conscious content, there might be a specific consciousness making mechanism that interacts with the content processing mechanism. They are particularly wary of a one-factor version of strong pluralism. If the mechanism for making vision conscious is fundamentally different from the mechanism for making hearing conscious, and this difference is intrinsic to how the content is processed, then you end up with a vast number of specific theories, one for each type of experience. This would fragment the field of consciousness science. Instead, they advocate for pluralism where distinct principles of consciousness are content neutral, meaning they can operate on different types of content. So, if strong pluralism is the more promising path, how do we keep it from becoming too chaotic? The authors emphasize that for pluralism to be scientifically useful, it needs to be constrained. Three main issues are crucial. First, the number of consciousness principles must be manageable. If there are hundreds or thousands of them, it becomes impossible to create a unified theory. Second, these principles need to have some kind of order or systematic structure. Think of the periodic table in chemistry, where elements are organized by their properties. This structure would allow us to create unified models and make predictions. The third issue, which they tackle in the next section, is a deep philosophical one. Can multiple scientifically distinct principles really belong to the same fundamental natural kind? This is where they discuss the idea of consciousness as a natural kind versus a scientific kind. Natural kinds are typically thought of as things that share fundamental essential properties like gold or water. The authors are skeptical that consciousness, if realized by multiple distinct principles, can fit this traditional definition of a natural kind. If the underlying mechanisms are too different, how can they all be variations of the same fundamental thing? They argue that trying to force multiple distinct consciousness principles into a single natural kind category might stretch the concept too thin. It could lead to theoretical tensions, where the commonalities become less informative. Instead, they propose that consciousness might be better understood as a scientific kind. Scientific kinds are grouped based on their functional or theoretical properties, rather than deep underlying essences. Think of planets. We group them as planets not because they're made of the exact same stuff, but because they function according to certain rules and fit within a scientific classification system that helps us understand our solar system. Treating consciousness as a scientific kind would allow for flexibility. Different theories might explain how certain principles generate consciousness, and these differences in implementation could be seen as tolerable variations within the broader scientific category of phenomenal consciousness. This approach could help reconcile the idea of multiple distinct consciousness principles with the goal of consciousness science as a unified endeavor. So, what is the takeaway from all of this? Primarily, the authors suggest that if pluralism is to be a viable framework for consciousness science, it must adopt a two-factor approach distinguishing content from consciousness itself. The number of consciousness principles needs to be limited, and these principles should have an organized structure. Crucially, they propose moving away from the idea of consciousness as a strict natural kind and towards viewing it as a more flexible scientific kind. This would allow for the integration of multiple distinct principles of consciousness within a unified scientific framework. It's a call for the field to be more explicit about its foundational assumptions, especially regarding what exactly makes consciousness a unified phenomenon worthy of study. While this might mean we won't get a single eureka moment that explains everything at once, a well-defined pluralistic approach could actually be a huge step forward. It could encourage different research groups to pursue their unique avenues, leading to a richer understanding of consciousness and potentially helping us address complex issues like interspecies differences and neurodiversity. It challenges us to think about how we categorize consciousness and its mechanisms, ultimately aiming for a more robust and comprehensive science. What I find really exciting about this paper is its honesty about the messiness of scientific progress. It acknowledges that disagreements and diverse findings aren't necessarily a sign of failure, but could point to a more complex reality. The idea of consciousness as a scientific kind is particularly compelling. It moves us away from rigid, perhaps unachievable definitions and towards a more pragmatic approach where the focus is on building a coherent scientific understanding, even if the underlying mechanisms prove to be more varied than we initially thought. It's a call for greater clarity and a more open-minded exploration of the vast landscape of consciousness. What do you think? Does the idea of multiple ways for consciousness to exist resonate with you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the wonders of the mind. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.